the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Brian Lomax.
And I'm Josh Berger. And in today's episode, we are going to do something a little bit different. We're going to talk about a quote from a poem. Um, the poem is called "If" by Rudyard Kipling. I'm sure many tennis players and many people listening to this podcast will be familiar with it. And it's a very, in terms of why we're thinking about this quote now is because, Wimbledon is currently going on. We're recording this on July 8th, which is the day after the women's semifinals, the day before the women's finals, the day of the men's semifinal. And as the players enter center court, the last thing that they often will see, the last thing that they'll see is this quote from this poem. And the quote is as follows: "If you can meet with triumph and disaster, and treat those two impostors just the same." And when it comes to this quote, and when it comes to not just that quote, but I think a lot of the ideas from this poem, and we can certainly link to this because it's certainly worth reading through. I think there are both micro and macro ways to apply this, right? When we think about both, our lives and, our character and sort of the person that we aim to be, I think the poem has that a lot of great content and a lot of valuable lessons that apply to that in terms of handling those triumphs, handling those disasters, handling all the ups and downs and turbulence that you are likely, I would say, inevitable to encounter, and remaining that person that you are and that person that you aim to be, really thinking about that personal character piece. And I think also on a micro level, whether it's, in a tennis match, whether it's those ups and downs that you will encounter, you are constantly facing triumph and constantly facing disaster, and that's an inherent part of being a tennis player and being an athlete and being a competitor. So I think this poem really has a lot to do with um, mental toughness and being a great competitor and keeping things in perspective as well. Um, so yeah, I think just sort of as a starting point, we can think about that quote and how this connects to certain competitive perspectives, and how athletes and coaches can incorporate some of these lessons into helping players become, their best version of themselves.
And I think it can inform even the work that we do, Josh, because let's say we have a player who is going out onto center court and they may win, they may lose. How do we want them to conduct themselves once the match is over? Ideally, they do the same thing regardless of the result. They walk back from the court with their head held high. Maybe they sign some autographs and they realize that this is just another experience that they've had that they can grow from, whether they won or whether they lost. Um, it's simply, one outcome, one experience in their whole lives. And I think that players actually are getting better and better at this over the years that they are handling, like, especially on the losing side. We're seeing more players say sign autographs after a loss instead of just rushing into the locker room, or they're waving, they're accepting the sort of congratulations of the crowd, for their valiant effort. And I think that to me is what I would want. I would want a player that I'm working with to walk off the court in the same way, whether they won or lost, to be proud of themselves for the effort that they gave, and to know that there's always another day, there's always another match. So if we won, we don't obviously want to just rest on our laurels there and be satisfied. We want to come out come off that court, proud of the effort, but then get back to it. We can maybe celebrate a little bit, but the next day we got to bring it all over again. And if we've lost, still be proud of your effort, everything you did to go out there. These, we're going to talk more about another sort of perhaps literary thing, Teddy Roosevelt's "Man in the Arena" speech. But everybody who goes out there, it takes so much courage to go out there and put yourself on the line. And then whether you win or you lose, when you come off the court, I want the players that I work with to recognize that. It takes a lot of guts to be out there and to go through that experience. And just know that it's another experience that you're building yourself into a great player. When we think of it as triumph and disaster, let's be honest. Sport is voluntary, right? We're not forced to do it, or hopefully we're not forced to do it. It's not some sort of penalty that we have to go through and so forth. And the reason I'm bringing that up is that we're voluntarily putting ourselves through all these obstacles, right? So in some ways, at an existential level, you could say these are somewhat unnecessary obstacles because we're volunteering to go out there and do this thing. But in the process of going through these obstacles, whether they're necessary or not, we are strengthening our character. We are becoming stronger for real life, in which there might be more necessary obstacles that we face. And so even just the practice of handling something like triumph and disaster in kind of an unnecessary arena makes us better people, especially if we can apply the message of Rudyard Kipling's poem here, is to treat them the same. In that, like you said earlier, Josh, really lies mental toughness, the ability to handle both of these things the same. And at that micro level, we're having triumph and disaster kind of go from moment to moment. I won a point, lost a point, won a point, won a point, won a point, lost a point, lost a point, right? And how can you deal with that and stay sane so that by the end of the match, you're still present enough to take an opportunity to win. And then, of course, the result of the match could be deemed a triumph or disaster, a win or a loss. How can I handle that and still be the same person that I was when I first came out? Well, it won't actually be the same person because you'll have had more experience. You'll become something better through that experience. And so I think there are a lot of really good themes here about how we leave that arena. Can we feel like whether I won or I lost, I got better today. I'm a better person for having gone through this. And it's important to say how I treat people. I can't let the fact that I lost give me an excuse for being short or impatient with others. I still need to be, if I see myself as a person of good character, that's not a legitimate reason to treat others poorly, right? So we want to make sure that, when we leave that, okay, we may be disappointed, but we still have to aspire to be our best selves as we're leaving that arena. And I think that's when, Kipling talks about that's when you'll be a man, when you can do this at the end of the poem. Because this poem, I believe, was written for his son and helping him understand what it means to be a man. And, so this is really where, obviously, women also play tennis. So it's not about being a man and more about being a functioning adult, somebody who can really positively contribute to a community or society. So I think it's really kind of cool that players get to see this as they go out onto the court. And it's a huge challenge to throw to a player, right, as they step out.
As if it wasn't enough of a challenge just to enter center court and play on the most historic and arguably the most important tennis court in the world. Being able to look at this hopefully provides players with some sort of strength or some sort of perspective about that battle that they're about to undertake. And to me, I think of this poem a lot as maturity, where, over, again, he's writing it to his son. If you can sort of withstand, you know, other people, if you can withstand, the lies and the deceit, and, there's a part in this where he talks about almost like gambling. Like, if you can make one heap of all your winnings and risk it on one turn of pitch and toss and lose, and start again at your beginnings and never breathe a word about your loss. It's like, if you can lose and lose everything and be able to bounce back, if you can, handle all of the emotions, all of the troubles, all of the ups and downs, and and recover and be resilient and be tough. And that is required to be a top tennis player. And we see it with all the players that get to the top of the game, right? I think they all show it in their own way. But they all have to have that resilience, because we know that tennis is a sport where you're not winning 100% of points, or even 75%, 70% of points. I mean, I know we've referred to it in the past, but Craig O'Shaughnessy, who does a lot of work with data and statistics, has talked about, how the best players in the world over time, right, not in one particular match, but over time, win somewhere around 55% of their points. And what does that mean? That they're losing right around 45% of their points. They're losing nearly half of the points that they play. So to me, that means a couple big things. Yes, we have to win the big ones, right? When it's a tiebreaker, when the set is on the line, when the match is on the line. But also, we're going to lose a bunch of points out there. And that's reality. We're not going to win every match 6-0, 6-0, no matter how good you are. And you need to be able to withstand losing point after, losing points, and going through maybe multiple games in a row, or playing a set where you didn't play your best, or even a match, or, multiple matches, going through a slump, and being able to withstand that. I mean, I think I could think of every top player has gone through periods of time where they haven't played their best, where their ranking has dropped, where they've lost maybe matches where people say they shouldn't have lost. Maybe we think about the critics, the people from the outside, who maybe say, oh, what are they doing? They should just retire. They shouldn't be out there anymore. But what makes them a champion is that they're resilient, that time and time again they come back, that they're better for it. I would say, having had those experiences makes them the person that they are. If everything is always easy, it's tough to really build character and develop in that same way, as if you've really experienced those ups and downs that they talk about in this. I mean, I know, Djokovic has, for example, has talked about his childhood and, growing up and, being in the bomb shelter and bombs being dropped. And I mean, I think we can think about so many examples of athletes, maybe less so in tennis based on some of the factors, socioeconomic factors, but I think in professional sports in general, of athletes that have really come through extreme turmoil, and maybe, in terms of how they grew up, and how that can really contribute to making you the person that you are. And I think this poem is a lot about sort of maturity and handling those twists and turns of life and coming out better for it.
We recently attended a conference in which Todd Martin was interviewed, and now I know he talked about this quote. I don't remember all the details, Josh, and I'm putting you on the spot here because I feel like you remember better than I do. But do you remember, some of Todd's reflections on this? Because I think he brought this up in relation to the Wimbledon semifinal he played against his good friend Malavia Washington.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I remember all of the details either, but I do remember him saying that, when he thinks back to that moment, that quote is maybe what's most impactful. And he did, end up losing that match, and in a painful way. And I think that, I think that it does speak to that quote, that they're, when as a top player, as any sort of player, you're gonna have those situations of disaster. And I think for him that, it was in that moment. And I think, Yeah, I don't remember all the specifics of it, but I remember, him recounting that moment and sort of what his experience was,
Yeah.
and how, as he thinks back to it, he does connect it to that quote, um, and that, that's sort of one of those lasting memories from there.
Yeah, and I think it's coming back to me a little bit that he was proud of the fact that he was the same guy when he left. Like he didn't
Hmm.
let that loss affect who he was. And that was the thing that he was most proud of that day is how he conducted himself afterwards. And I think that is an important aspect of things. Um, Even as you were talking earlier, it did remind me. Maybe we should introduce a little bit about the man in the arena speech because you kind of went there a little bit. So um, Teddy Roosevelt, who was the 26th president of the United States, gave a speech in 1910 on a tour of Europe. The speech was actually more about citizenship, and it's a long speech, and it won a Pulitzer Prize. But there's a section in there um, that refers to the man in the arena, and the speech is often called the man in the arena speech. So I'm going to read that piece because I think it's important from a couple different lenses. It's important from the lens of being a parent, coach, a fan, but also the player. And yes, again, the language here is about using man, but more inclusively, we're certainly talking about all people that have the courage to do this. So here's the relevant part of the speech. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. So, what I like about that is, first of all, it is giving all the credit to the person who's out there, who has is facing the obstacles, and here facing the prospect of triumph and disaster, and going through that. That person should be celebrated because of the courage and bravery that it takes to go out there, and we have to appreciate that they're experiencing that in their own way. We as fans, coaches, parents, we can look at it, we can criticize it, we can do whatever. We really don't know what they're experiencing out there. And um, they maybe have to experience some of these disasters at times um, because it might be the experience they need in order to grow and be better going forward, right? So, David Samuel, who we had on the podcast some months ago, he's coached Liam Brody, and so David has a cool podcast of like these little nuggets that he puts out there, and he talked about a concept that you and I have mentioned, Josh, about a lot of these experiences that players go through are necessary experiences. We can't really teach some of these concepts. Players have to actually go out there and experience it and feel it and before they know what it is. And so David was talking about that with respect to Liam and how he didn't know if he could play, multiple five setters in a row and still trust his body. It was an experience that he needed to actually have and go out there. And so when we as parents or coaches are watching our players or people that we know are playing, we have to, as much as we want to prepare them and teach them and so forth, sometimes they just need to go out there and feel it. And a lot of that is going to be the hard experiences. It's going to be the disasters. And we want to make sure that we are compassionate and encouraging with respect to that because it's so hard to be the person in the arena. And many people who watch tennis or criticize it or write about it or whatever, they've never felt it before. And certainly not at that level, certainly not at the level of consequences or what's really on the line. And I think the more that we can have compassion for, but then encourage those players to continue on, the better it is for the player. Right? I know sports writers, that's different. That they don't have to have compassion or whatever. They can do their job. But I think parents and coaches, players don't go out there in general trying to lose, trying to give no effort, trying to tank. And so we have to accept that they're the ones out in the arena. They're experiencing it. We've got to celebrate the fact that it takes a lot of courage to do that with everything that may be on the line. Even if it's, again, voluntary and these are not necessary obstacles in our lives, it's great training. And if we can be looking at it through that lens, helping them treat triumph and disaster the same, and then also celebrating the fact that they've got the courage and the bravery to put themselves out in the arena without knowing what could happen. I think that to me, these two things actually really work nicely together.
I totally agree. And when you brought up that quote from the man in the arena, I think it has a lot to do with what we're seeing out there at Wimbledon right now. I think as people are competing, as people are trying to play any sport at a high level and trying to, be in that arena, in their own personal arena, whatever that may be, there will be those times where you fall, right? I mean, Teddy Roosevelt talks in this quote, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming. But who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasm, the great devotions, et cetera, et cetera. So, by striving, you will fail. You will come up short again and again. And that's a part of it. That's a part of striving. But what's more courageous, what's ultimately should be looked at in a very positive way is the fact that you are striving, is the fact that you're out there. As I was looking into this quote a little bit more, I think this is really, I think Teddy Roosevelt this was about cynics, right? This is about people that are cynical, about those who are trying to make the world a better place, those who are trying to make change ultimately. And it's a lot easier. One thing that I think about is, talking to athletes, it's often easier to discuss some of these things when I'm at my desk and they're at their desk or on their computer and they're not in the heat of the moment, right? It's very easy to discuss some of these things, to come up with a plan for different situations. But when you're in the heat of the moment, it's a whole different story. It's a lot harder to think clearly out there. It's a lot harder to maybe always make the right decision. And it's tough. It's tough to be in that arena. It's tough to have that pressure on you. It's tough to be under the spotlight. It's tough to be competing in a tight match. It's tough to be out there on those days where you're not playing well. Playing competitive sport is really challenging. But I think this quote reminds us what great courage it takes in the first place to be out there, to be putting yourself on the line, putting your ego on the line, putting maybe your reputation on the line, being out there, having other people be able to judge you and be able to make comments because you're out there doing the thing, rather than, being at home and simply observing others or simply critiquing or being in that position. So I think both quotes are definitely connected and definitely connected with both what's going on in Wimbledon right now, and we will have an episode devoted to that. And also what every athlete goes through, right? When they're in that competitive, when they're competing, when they're in that frame of mind of, you're risking something, whether it's, as we said, that ego, that reputation, that ranking, how others think of you, you're laying it out on the line.
Yeah. And well, first of all, what a great description of tennis here, right? There is who errs, who comes short again and again. No effort without error and shortcoming. Yeah, that's a beautiful description of how tennis works, right? But as you were talking, it was making me think about how do we talk to players after a match? And as coaches and as parents, we often have something called the righting reflex. We want to correct and fix. And we have to resist that urge because, as you were saying, as we've both been saying here, it's the athlete who's out there who's experiencing it. And so we want to ask more open-ended questions about what were you feeling out there? How did it feel to you when you were in this situation? Describe for me the thoughts and the emotions you had. What did your body feel like during these moments? Without more, details about the sort of the richness of their experience, whatever you might say right after a match may be completely irrelevant. And so the more that we can be asking these open-ended questions and letting the player describe for us what his or her experience was out there, and then going with that because that's what's right. That's what they felt. Can we help them process that experience? Can we help them maybe prepare for it a little bit better the next time? Us seeing some sort of technical issue on a serve or a forehand, it could be completely irrelevant. That might not even be the root cause. That might be a symptom of something else that we're seeing, right? So I think it's important as coaches and parents that we ask good open-ended questions, we listen to understand the experience, and then go from there. A great technique that a lot of sports psych professionals use, also a lot of counselors use, is something called motivational interviewing. Something that'd be great for parents and coaches to look at because anybody can use that. And it's really more about helping the other person, or in our case, the player, understand what's happening. And if some sort of behavior change is necessary, getting them to a place where they want to change something in their game, in their life, etc. So yeah, it's just it prompted me to think about that, Josh, your last talk there about, all right, we've got a lot of people looking from the outside. And of course, a lot of people who listen to this podcast are maybe people on the outside. They may be coaches and parents, and they want to help their players more. And so I think first, recognizing how courageous it is to get out there. And second, let's have that person then try to describe more what their experience has been like. Don't assume you know. Because that's something I think we all do as humans, is put ourselves like how I would be in that situation and then think that that's valid. That's the right response. Well, you're not that person, right? We are not Nick Kyrgios. His life is his life. A lot of people, when I say this kind of thing, don't necessarily buy into it right away, but people are doing the best they can given who they are and given their own personal experiences. It's very difficult to say, well, I in that situation would do this. Well, yeah, you don't have the same experience as that person, so you're not that person. You can't be that. And like I said before, most people don't go out there trying to screw up. No one says, oh, I can't wait to be the worst person in the world today. So we're typically, in general, people are doing the best they can. And we have to, that may not be your best, but they're doing the best they can based on who they are. And we have to be empathetic of that. We have to try to encourage that, that they continue to strive. So I think it's difficult to accept that sometimes. But I think the more that we can learn to understand that people are not trying to be terrible people, they're not trying to lose or act badly, but there's something else going on. And that person is doing the best he or she can do to cope with whatever those circumstances are. But we got to keep in mind, hey, that's the person in the arena. That's the person who's out there. this is how they're responding to that. And the more we can try to get from them what they were thinking, what they were feeling, how they were processing that experience, the better we can help them uh, do better going forward.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm glad that you brought up motivational interviewing because it's a really powerful technique that I think is underutilized, certainly. There's actually a great book, Coaching Athletes to Be Their Best, written by a few sports psychology professionals, Jonathan Fader, Stephen Rolnick, Jeff Brecken, and Teresa Moyers, where they talk a lot about this, how we can use this technique and apply it to a sport context where coaches and people and parents and those involved in sports can help when communicating with athletes to try to first empathize, first try to see things from their perspective, hear out their perspective, rather than instantly coming in with, what was wrong. And as you said, that writing, that writing urge or that writing reflex, whatever the actual, I forget the actual term. But I think that's really powerful here, where it's, let's first give them credit for being out there, right? Maybe you're that parent or you're that coach, and what you saw out there was disappointing, right? We're not trying to necessarily see this through rose-colored glasses, where maybe their performance was not their best, right? That's going to happen. Everybody does have those days. I could think of any top professional, and there are those days. But let's start from that point of empathy. Let's see what takes place on the court, whether it's tanking, whether it's negative emotions, whether it's a loss of focus. And rather than just getting upset about that, rather than criticizing that person, let's try to take a step back and try to think, where does this come from? Right? Where are those negative emotions coming from? Or do we see those in other areas of their life? Is this something they've been actively working on? Is this something they're aware of? Right? Rather than coming down on them for the emotions itself, let's try to take a step back and let's, analyze it a bit further and almost try to see from their perspective where that's coming from, how they think it impacts things, and, go from there rather than instantly coming in with this urge to fix it.
Yeah, or concluding that, like, so and so doesn't care, right, or not motivated, right? There's a great example in that book about a soccer player who consistently was turning up late for training, and so the coaches came to this conclusion that the kid didn't care. Well, they dove into it a little bit more, and they learned that the kid actually had to take two buses and a subway ride to get to the training ground on time because he lived an hour and a half away, and nobody in his family had a car. So, does he not care? Or does he care so much that he's taking two buses and a subway ride to get to the academy? And that's why he's late, right? So you quickly go from this kid doesn't care to, wow, this kid's really putting a lot in just to get here as quickly as he can. Maybe he does care a lot. So we can't assume based on the limited information that we have, right? If we see somebody tanking, all right, we need to know why. What's going on? Maybe there's something happening in their life that is just like completely distracted them. That type of thing, So we've kind of veered off a lot here from the the original poem, but I think it's been some good stuff to get into because I think many of us are looking from the outside at what happens at a place like Wimbledon, right? We're recording this the day after Rafael Nadal has announced he's not going to play in the semifinal, and there's some criticism of that. I think we can get into that in our next episode, but that certainly drove a lot of my desire to talk about the man in the arena today. I know you wanted to talk about if. I think this is really matched up very well, very thematic with what's happening in London. And it's kind of cool that that's like one of the last things that players see. We were talking before we began recording. Other iconic places, sporting places in the world have similar types of things. It made me think of the Montreal Canadiens. So for our Canadian listeners, perhaps they'll enjoy this. But there's a quote in their locker room from a poem called "In Flanders Field" by John McCrae, and it says, and this is something that you talk to anybody who's played for the Canadians, this is really important to them. This particular quote from a poem. It says, "To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high." And that's a franchise that has a lot of history to it. Has been very successful throughout the years. Not so much in the last, say, 20 years in terms of winning Stanley Cups, but before that in the 20th century, lots of Stanley Cups. And the players take it seriously that there's a legacy to carrying on. Certain other stadiums, Liverpool Football Club in England, they have a sign, this is Anfield, and it's something that the players touch as they go out onto the field, and that means something to them. So these are almost like these are quotes, they're rituals, they're inspiration to athletes. Gets me thinking about, like, if you're working at an academy or a high school or a college, can you create some of these little rituals? Can you have some of these more inspiring quotes in your environment so that players are seeing it, taking that message in, and it's helping to build their character. It's helping to motivate and inspire them as they, go into the arena to compete.
Definitely, definitely. When you were talking about how we don't know what somebody's going through, I think that is, I think a prime example of that is Nick Kyrgios, actually. And we talked about, unfortunately, Nadal had to pull out of his semifinal match, which, leads to Nick Kyrgios going to the finals. His first, it was his first time in the semis, reaching the semis, and it'll be his first Grand Slam final. And I think throughout his career, many people have been very critical of him, myself included at times, over his attitude, over, tanking at times, over the way that he acts towards, others, whether they be opponents or fans or officials or many people around him. And I think it's important when we think about him as an example to think about what he's gone through. And he has spoken pretty openly in recent times about some of the real struggles that he's had from a mental health perspective, talking about really dark times, talking about suicidal thoughts, talking about self-harm. And, I think it's when we look at somebody and their behavior, and particularly that behavior in a match, but also off the court, it's important to keep it all in context and think about, we don't know what's going on in somebody's life. We don't know how that person is struggling. It's very easy to see it from an outsider's perspective and say they should be doing this. They should be doing this. He should be number one in the world, or he should have won all these Grand Slams by now. But that's not his experience, right? He had his upbringing, he's had his struggles, and this is where he's at right now. And he's at, his first Grand Slam final, and that should be celebrated rather than thinking about, the critics and what they think, he should have done, or he should have had this sort of ranking, or should have had, more results at this point. I think rather trying to view somebody with empathy and trying to understand their perspective. And, I think also with somebody like him, he has found in his own way, again, a deeper sense of meaning, where now he's, become more involved in charity. He started his own charity and kids, and again, not in maybe the traditional way, but has, really tried to speak out on topics that he's passionate about, and has tried to maybe find a deeper meaning where, I think for a long time, it seemed like he struggled to find that. And I think maybe, has reached that point of maturity in his own life where now he's ready to bring out some of his best tennis on the biggest stage, but also I think at a personal level, again, maybe speculating here, but it seems like has found, more deeper meaning, has found more, connection to things that are important to him. And, we as outsiders, as critics, as not the person in the arena, shouldn't judge necessarily, even though it can be easy to do that at times, but instead try to, as much as possible, see things from his perspective and view him in all situations with empathy. and understand people are, doing their best, and that may look very different at times.
Yeah, and let's hope that Nick is able to really um, take in this experience and do the best that he can, um, and that that he meets the moment. I think that would be great. Um, of course, not everybody's a Nick Kyrgios fan, and you can understand why, but we also don't want him to just be horrible in that moment. And it's going to be a big moment for him. It'd be uh, we don't know who he'll play. He could play another first-time finalist in Cam Norrie, or he could play somebody who's got quite a bit of experience at that level, which typically we don't see first-time finalists beat legends of that caliber. But that doesn't mean he can't play a brilliant match, and he certainly has the ability to beat anybody when he's on. So, who knows what could happen with that, right? Um, so I think this has been an interesting discussion, Josh, in terms of using some literary guides here to helping not only players but coaches and parents understand some different perspectives on what it means to experience winning and losing, triumph and disaster, making mistakes, and also the character required to simply go out on the court and compete. I think in the Teddy Roosevelt um, quote, one of the aspects of it was in terms of being actually the person who goes out there. A lot of people don't compete. Uh, the game of tennis is rather vicious mentally because there is all this constant feedback about winning and losing going on through the match, and that's difficult for many people to take. Lots of people don't return to tournament tennis because of that. And so we have to realize how difficult that is. And so I think it's really been an interesting discussion. Do you have any sort of last thoughts to summarize?
Um, yeah, no, I think it's a good point that you're bringing up, that a lot of people don't compete. And I think people shy away from competing for different reasons. Sometimes it's the fear of failure, or maybe perceived failure, we could say, of, being out there, laying it out on the line and coming up short. Um, Maybe people don't necessarily always see it as a necessary part of the improvement process, the necessary part of playing your best. But it is really important, and it does take a lot of courage to compete, to to be that man in the arena. And yeah, I think these two quotes, and we can certainly link to a full version of them so people can read them for themselves and maybe draw some of your own conclusions. Have a lot to do with competing and being the best competitor you can be in general.
Yeah, right. Well, thank you, Josh. That was great. Great discussion. And thank all of you for listening. For more on today's episode, please check out the show notes. If you have any feedback or questions for me and Josh, please email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. You can also use the Twitter hashtag tennisiq. Additionally, please subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice, including YouTube, so you can be notified of new episodes. And you can check us out on Instagram. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon in our next episode.